The rain was a forgotten language on his tongue. Elara tilted his head back, letting the cold, clean drops wash the sterile taste of recycled air from his mouth. Each one was a small absolution, a percussive beat against skin that had known only the filtered hum of the bastion's life support for 22 years. The mud beneath his bare feet, thick and clinging, was a revelation. It was real. It was chaos. It was everything the polished chrome and synthesized scent fields of his former life were not. He was not Unit 734 anymore. He was not a genetic asset awaiting assignment. He was just Elara, a name he had whispered to himself in the dark, a secret syllable of defiance. Freedom smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, a pungent, organic perfume that made his head spin. For a week, this scent had been his entire world. It was the scent of being alive, a raw and untamed thing. He pressed his palm against the rough bark of a pine, the sticky resin a tactile shock. In the Omega wing, every surface had been smooth, non-porous, easily sanitized. Touch had been a clinical transaction, gloved and brief. Here the world pushed back, textured and alive. He was a ghost haunting a world he was never meant to see, and every sensation was a tether pulling him further into reality. But the scent of rain and pine was suddenly corrupted. A new note pierced the humid air, sharp and sterile and utterly familiar. Ozone, antiseptic, and the cold, dominant musk of a high-ranking alpha. A scent he had studied, synthesized, and worn like a borrowed skin. The scent of Warden Kalen. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. His breath hitched. The forest, a moment ago a sanctuary, became a cage of interlocking branches. He flattened himself against the tree, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. It was impossible. He had covered his tracks. He had used the river, the storm. The tracking implant in his wrist had been neutralized, a painful, bloody procedure performed with a shard of sharpened metal in the shadow of a collapsed transit station. He was a ghost. Ghosts could not be scented. A shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom between the trees. Tall, clad in the severe grey uniform of the bastion's enforcers, the figure moved with an unnatural silence. The rain did not seem to touch him, or perhaps he simply ignored it. Kalen stopped 20 feet away, his posture one of calm, predatory stillness. His face was a study in controlled lines, handsome in a way that was more architectural than human. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were fixed on Elara. They held no anger. They held a chilling, dispassionate curiosity, the look of a scientist observing a fascinating, flawed specimen. Unit 734? Kalen's voice was low, resonant, cutting through the sound of the rain without effort. It was the voice that had announced reconditioning schedules over the wing's comms, the voice that had dictated the terms of their existence. Your unauthorized excursion is concluded. Elara's defiance was a fragile, flickering flame. My name is Elara. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or mild surprise, crossed the warden's face. It was gone in an instant. Your designation is 734. Your emotional attachments to unsanctioned phonemes are irrelevant. He took a step forward. The scent of him intensified, a wave of pure, undiluted alpha presence that made the synthetic version Elara had crafted seem like a child's crude drawing. This was the real thing. It was power. It was command. It was everything he had run from. The sensitive glands along Elara's neck ached in response, an involuntary biological submission that he hated with every fiber of his being. He had gambled everything on a lie, a meticulously crafted biologically impossible lie. On the pale skin of his neck, just over the scent gland, was the mark, a delicate, puckered scar that looked for all the world like an alpha's bonding bite. His masterpiece, a forgery so perfect it had fooled the Bastion's most advanced bioscanners. He had spent years diverting nutrient paste to cultivate the specific cell cultures, months synthesizing the pheromonal cocktail in a hidden corner of the med lab where he'd been assigned cleaning duties. He had chosen Kalen's scent signature for its potency, its authority. No one would question the warden's claim. It was the perfect camouflage. An Omega bonded to the warden himself would be granted a transfer to a low-security residential spire, a prelude to a formal union. It was from that spire, a gilded cage instead of a sterile one, that he had made his escape. Kalen's eyes dropped to the mark. The rain slicked Ilara's skin, making the scar tissue gleam faintly in the dim forest light. The anomaly, Kalen murmured, more to himself than to Ilara. A fascinating piece of work. The cellular scarring is nearly flawless, the pheromonal residue ingenious, but fading. He took another step. Ilara flinched back, his spine hitting the rough bark. He was cornered. The brief, intoxicating taste of freedom was turning to ash in his mouth. How? Kalen's voice was no longer that of an enforcer, but of a scholar faced with an impossible paradox. A bond is a sympathetic neurochemical event. It cannot be fabricated. The alpha's saliva contains genetic markers that rewrite the Omega's cellular structure at the site of the bite. It is a biological absolute. Ilara said nothing. His silence was his last remaining weapon. He would not give the architect of his cage the satisfaction of understanding how he had picked the lock. No matter, Kalen said, his voice returning to its default state of command. The discrepancy will be analyzed. You will be recalibrated. He raised a hand, and from the shadows, 2 more enforcers emerged, their faces obscured by helmets, their movements synchronized and robotic. They carried suppression cuffs and a tranquilizer rifle. The sight of the rifle sent a jolt of pure terror through him. Recalibration, a sterile word for the systematic destruction of self. They would strip his memories, dampen his emotions, and rebuild him into the compliant, placid asset he was supposed to be. The ghost of Ilara would be exorcised, and only Unit 734 would remain. He would not let it happen. With a raw cry, he lunged, not at Kalen, but to the side, into the thickest part of the undergrowth. Branches whipped at his face. Thorns tore at his thin tunic. He ran, fueled by a desperate, primal surge of adrenaline. He could hear the enforcers behind him, their heavy boots crashing through the forest floor. He was faster, more agile, his body lean and conditioned by years of mandatory physical regimens. But they were relentless. A sharp, stinging pain erupted in his shoulder, the tranquilizer dart. His legs grew heavy, his vision blurring at the edges. The world tilted, the scent of wet earth rising up to meet him. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the mud. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Kalen's boots stopping in front of him. The last thing he smelled was the warden's scent, a cold, clean, inescapable cage closing around him, and beneath it, a faint, almost imperceptible note of something else, something that was not part of the Bastion's sanctioned emotional spectrum. Frustration and a deep, unsettling curiosity. The scientist had found his specimen. The experiment was about to begin. The rain fell harder, washing the mud from his cheek like a final, fleeting caress from a world he had only just begun to know. Warden Kalen watched as the enforcers secured the unconscious Omega. They were efficient, their movements devoid of any wasted energy. They cuffed Unit 734's hands and feet, attached a biomonitor to its neck, and loaded it onto a grav stretcher. The entire process was clinical, standard procedure for asset retrieval. Yet nothing about this situation was standard. Kalen stood under the canopy of the ancient forest, the steady drumming of rain on the leaves a dissonant sound against the hum of the stretcher's anti-grav field. He rarely left the pristine, climate-controlled environment of the bastion. The air here was thick, heavy with moisture, and the complex, chaotic sense of organic life and decay. It was inefficient, unsanitary, and yet it held a certain raw vitality that the bastion, for all its perfection, lacked. He dismissed the thought as unproductive. His focus remained on the Omega, Unit 734. Elara. The unsanctioned name was a symptom of the deeper malfunction, a defect in its psychological conditioning. It had looked at him with something more than fear. Defiance, a clear, sharp, intelligent defiance that was not supposed to be possible in a product of their meticulous breeding and education programs. Omegas were designed for receptivity, for compliance. Their purpose was to ensure the genetic continuity of the bastion's elite alpha lines. They were the most precious of assets, vessels of the future, and their stability was paramount. This one was unstable, aberrant, and brilliant. Kalen reached out, his gloved finger tracing the air just above the forged bonding mark on the Omega's neck. The grav stretcher whirred softly, carrying its cargo toward the waiting transport, a sleek, dark vessel that seemed to absorb the light around it. The mark was the crux of the entire anomaly. Bioscans from the transfer spire had confirmed its authenticity. Pheromonal analysis had matched the signature to Kalen's own. Everything in the data suggested he had claimed this Omega, a public, recorded, undeniable fact. Except he had never touched it. He had seen Unit 734, of course, during routine inspections of the Omega wing. He remembered it as one of the quieter ones, unobtrusive, with pale hair and eyes the color of faded sea glass. It had never drawn attention to itself. A model of compliance. It was a perfect deception. The sheer intellectual audacity of the act was what truly captivated him. To conceive of such a plan required a profound understanding of the bastion's biological and social systems. To execute it required a level of scientific skill and resourcefulness that was unheard of in an Omega. They were not trained for such things. Their education was focused on art, history, and genetic theory, enough to make them suitable companions, but not enough to empower them. Someone had helped it. That was the logical conclusion. A sympathizer within the med lab, a disgruntled technician. But his preliminary investigation had yielded nothing. No one had access to the restricted compounds necessary for this kind of synthesis. No one but the highest-level geneticists. And him. He boarded the transport, the door hissing shut behind him, sealing out the chaotic symphony of the forest. The interior was Spartan, bathed in the cool blue-white light of the bastion. The air scrubbers kicked in, replacing the scent of rain and earth with the familiar, sterile neutrality he preferred. The two enforcers stood at attention, silent sentinels. The Omega lay on the stretcher, its breathing deep and even under the tranquilizer's influence. In repose, it looked fragile, almost delicate. The sharp edges of its defiance were smoothed away, leaving only the fine-boned structure of its face, the pale sweep of its lashes against its cheek. It was aesthetically pleasing, genetically sound, a prime asset, wasted on this rebellion. Kalen sat in the observer's chair, the ship lifting silently from the forest floor. He removed his gloves, placing them on the console beside him. He brought up the Omega's file on the holographic display that shimmered into existence before him. Unit 734, 22 cycles, optimal genetic markers, high intelligence quotient, noted as a potential risk for emotional instability. A footnote in its early psychological profile mentioned a tendency toward excessive introspection. It had been flagged for monitoring, but no corrective action had been deemed necessary. An oversight, a critical, system-level oversight. The Bastion was a system of perfect order. Every citizen, from the ruling alphas to the beta technicians, had a purpose. Every variable was controlled. Scent was regulated. Emotions were managed through chemical supplements and psychological conditioning. Instinct was a primitive relic, a dangerous variable that had been engineered out of their bloodlines over generations. The bond was the one concession to that primal past, a sacred biological imperative that ensured stability and lineage. It was the bedrock of their society. And this Omega, this single flawed asset, had treated it like a lock to be picked. It was not just an escape. It was an act of profound heresy. He zoomed the display in on the medical report filed when the bond was first registered. The attending medic, a reliable beta, had noted the Omega's placid state, its scent glands producing the expected submissive pheromones of a newly claimed mate, all within expected parameters. The deception was not just chemical, it was psychological. The Omega had performed its role perfectly. It had faked not just a mark, but an entire state of being. The transport moved through the perpetual twilight of the outer sectors, the smog-choked ruins of a forgotten era. The Bastion rose in the distance, a gleaming white needle piercing the grey sky. A monument to order in a world of chaos. His world, the world he was sworn to protect. And the greatest threat to that order was not an external force, but a flaw within. An idea. The idea that the system could be broken, that biology could be forged, that an Omega could choose its own fate. He had to understand how. Not just for security, not just to patch the vulnerability in the system. It was a personal intellectual imperative. This problem, this Omega, had burrowed into his mind. It was an equation with an impossible solution, and it demanded to be solved. He would not hand it over to the recalibration center. Not yet. The technicians there were butchers, not scientists. They would wipe its mind, erasing the very data he needed to collect. No, he would handle this interrogation personally. He would disassemble the Omega's defiance, piece by piece, until he found the core of its unique, impossible rebellion. He would understand its methods, its motivations, its every thought. He looked at the Omega's still form. The fading, forged scent of his own pheromones still clung to it, a strange, dissonant echo. It was like looking at a reflection in a warped mirror. The transport docked with the warden's private spire, a place of monastic silence and solitude. The enforcers transferred the stretcher, their movements as precise as ever. "Take it to the tertiary holding cell," Kalen ordered. No sedatives, no comfort measures, standard sensory deprivation protocols. "I will begin the interview at 0600. The lead enforcer nodded. "And its designation, Warden?" Kalen paused. He looked at the pale, unconscious face, at the faint tremor of its eyelids. The name it had given itself in the forest, a useless, sentimental sound, echoed in his mind. the defiance in its eyes. To use its given number felt insufficient. It reduced a complex, fascinating anomaly to a simple data point. The asset's designation, Kalen said, his voice cold and precise, correcting his own momentary lapse, is Unit 734. That is all it is. That is all it will be. But as the enforcers wheeled the stretcher away, a part of his analytical mind noted the lie. It was already more than that. It was a puzzle. And Kalen had always been drawn to puzzles, especially the ones that everyone else believed were impossible to solve. The silence was the first thing he registered, not the filtered, humming silence of the Omega wing, which was merely the absence of loud noise, but a profound, bottomless silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. It was a weighted silence, thick and suffocating. Then came the absence of light, a total, complete darkness that his eyes, accustomed to the perpetual twilight of corridors and the soft glow of lumen panels, could not penetrate. He blinked, but the view remained the same, an infinite, featureless black. He was floating in a void. He tried to move, and his hands met a smooth, cold surface. A floor. He was lying on a floor. He sat up slowly, his muscles aching from the tranquilizer. The air was cool, dry, and utterly neutral. It had no scent. None. The recyclers in this room were of a higher grade than any he had ever encountered, scrubbing the air of every stray molecule. It was sensory deprivation, a technique used to break down a subject's psychological defenses. He was a subject, an experiment. He was back in the cage. Ilara drew his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them. The thin tunic he wore was the only texture in this smooth, seamless world. He focused on the feeling of the rough spun fabric against his skin, the pressure of his own limbs. He had to anchor himself. Without sensory input, the mind began to create its own. He could not afford to lose his grip. He had one thing left, the truth of what he had done, and he would not give it to Kalen. He did not know how long he sat there. Time had ceased to have meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. His thoughts began to drift, memories rising unbidden from the darkness. The sterile scent of the med lab, the hiss of the sanitizer, the weight of the data slate in his hands as he secretly studied restricted biochemical texts. He remembered the first time he'd managed to synthesize a simple pheromone, a beta's calming scent. He had dabbed a tiny amount on his wrist, and for a full shift, the supervising medic had treated him with a placid indifference instead of the usual sharp-eyed scrutiny. It was a small thing, a minor success, but it had planted a seed. The idea that he could control his environment, that he could manipulate the very air around him, was intoxicating. Scent was power in the Bastion, and he had learned to forge it. The memory of the pain was sharp, carving the bonding mark into his own neck with a sterilized medical scalpel, biting down on a folded tunic to keep from screaming. Applying the synthetic pheromonal paste and the cell-grafting agent he had stolen, molecule by molecule, over the course of a year. He had collapsed from the pain and blood loss, waking hours later in a feverish haze. But when he had looked in the polished metal of the dispenser, he had seen it. A perfect, raw, bleeding copy of a bond mark, smelling faintly of the warden. His ticket out. He touched his neck now. The scar tissue was smooth, healed, a lie made flesh. A soft click echoed in the silence. A section of the wall opposite him dissolved into light, a perfect white square that was painfully bright. He squinted, raising a hand to shield his eyes. A figure was silhouetted in the doorway. Tall, severe, Warden Kalen. Kalen stepped into the room. The door slid silently shut behind him, plunging them back into darkness. But only for a second. Soft, indirect light bloomed from the ceiling, illuminating a minimalist space. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all a seamless, matte white. In the center of the room were two chairs, also white, facing each other. They had not been there before. They must have risen from the floor. "Sit," Kalen commanded. His voice was calm, devoid of inflection. Ilara remained on the floor, his arms still wrapped around his knees. It was a small act of defiance, but it was his. Kalen's expression did not change. He walked to one of the chairs and sat down, his posture perfect, his hands resting on his knees. He simply waited. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in his hands. Ilara knew the tactic. The interrogator exerts no pressure, forcing the subject to break the silence, to fill the void. The first one to speak loses control. Ilara pressed his lips together, focusing on his breathing. In, out, a slow, steady rhythm. Minutes passed. The only sound was the faint, almost sub-audible hum of the air circulation system. Kalen was unnervingly still, a statue carved from ice and shadow. Finally he spoke again, his voice as quiet as before. "The average Omega psyche collapses after 17 hours in this environment. You have been in here for 26. Your resilience is anomalous." So it had been over a day. Ilara felt a grim satisfaction. He was an anomaly. That was his strength. "I require an explanation," Kalen continued. "Detail the process by which you fabricated the bonding mark. Provide a full schematic of the chemical compounds used. Name your accomplices." Ilara finally looked up, meeting the warden's cold, grey eyes. "I have no accomplices." "That is statistically improbable. The resources required are beyond the clearance level of any Omega. Your denial is illogical. Nevertheless, it's the truth." Ilara's voice was hoarse from disuse. Kalen leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying. "Let us examine the logic. You believe that withholding this information grants you some form of leverage. It does not. The Bastion's resources are infinite. Our geneticists will reverse engineer your forgery. It is inevitable. Your cooperation will merely expedite the process. It may also mitigate the severity of your recalibration." The word sent a chill through him, but he forced his face to remain blank. "What do you want, Warden? To fix the flaw in your perfect system? To make sure no other asset gets the idea that the cage has a door?" For the first time, a genuine emotion flickered in Kalen's eyes. It was not anger. It was intellectual hunger. "I want to understand the mind that conceived of it. The biological imperative of a bond is absolute. To defy it, to replicate it through artificial means, it is like a primitive trying to build a star. I want to know how you learned the language of creation." The almost poetic turn of phrase was jarring, coming from him. This was not just about security. This was personal for him. The scientist in him had overshadowed the warden. Ilara saw a flicker of a weakness, a potential crack in that cold facade. Kalen was not driven by duty alone. He was driven by obsession. "You wouldn't understand," Ilara said, his voice barely a whisper. "To you, the bond is a tool for control, a guarantee of lineage. For us, for me, it was just another lock on the door. I just found a way to make my own key." He remembered the others in the wing, Omegas who yearned for a bond, who lived for the day an Alpha would choose them. They saw it as completion, as purpose. Ilara had always seen it as erasure. the final surrender of self. He had watched bonded Omegas, their personalities sanded down, their entire existence revolving around their alpha. He would rather be dissected than become a placid, smiling reflection of another's will. Kalen was silent for a long moment, processing. His analytical gaze swept over Ilara, cataloguing his defiant posture, the subtle tremor in his hands, the faint, lingering scent of the forest that even the scrubbers hadn't completely erased from his skin and clothes. The key, Kalen repeated softly. You see freedom as an escape from your biological nature. A flawed premise. Your nature is your function. To deny it is to invite chaos. I lived in your order for 22 years, Ilara countered, his voice gaining strength. I'll take my chances with chaos. Kalen stood up. The interview is over. For now. The door slid open behind him. Your resistance is noted. It is also finite. He paused in the doorway, looking back at Ilara, who was still huddled on the floor. You are a fascinating equation, Unit 734. But all equations can be solved. Sooner or later. The door closed, and the main lights extinguished, leaving Ilara once again in the oppressive, silent dark. But something had changed. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was an equation, a puzzle, and the warden was the one who intended to solve him. The thought was terrifying, but it also contained a sliver of hope. A puzzle is not simply erased. It must be engaged with, understood. And in that engagement, in that forced intimacy of interrogation and analysis, perhaps there was a chance to do more than just resist, a chance to make the warden see the flaw not in him, but in the system that created him. The cold floor seemed to leach the warmth from his body, but a tiny, defiant ember of hope remained, glowing stubbornly in the crushing darkness. Kalen sat in his office, the cityscape of the bastion spread out below him like a glowing circuit board. The view was one of perfect, geometric order, a lattice of light and structure that he had always found calming. Tonight, it offered no peace. On the holographic display before him, a complex molecular diagram rotated slowly. It was the result of the latest analysis of the tissue sample taken from Unit 734's forged bond mark. The data was infuriatingly contradictory. The cellular structure was a near-perfect match for a true bond scar, indicating the use of a highly sophisticated grafting agent. The residual pheromones were a synthetic cocktail, as he'd suspected, but they were bound to the tissue with a protein that seemed to be adapting. It was actively mimicking his own biosignature with a startling degree of accuracy, degrading at a much slower rate than any known synthetic compound. It was impossible. It was elegant. He swiped a hand, and the diagram was replaced with a live feed of the holding cell. Unit 734 was curled on the floor, asleep. Even in the low-light imaging, he could see the tension in its form. It was not the restful sleep of a compliant subject, but the wary, shallow slumber of a cornered animal. Its resilience was remarkable. 26 hours of sensory deprivation should have induced a state of suggestibility, of psychological collapse. Instead, the Omega had met him with coherent, focused defiance. It had not broken. It had challenged him. I'll take my chances with chaos. The statement echoed in his mind. It was the antithesis of the Bastion's entire philosophy. The Bastion had been born from the ashes of a chaotic world, a world destroyed by primitive instincts and emotional excess. Order was not a preference. It was a survival mechanism. To choose chaos was to choose extinction. And yet, the Omega had made that choice Without hesitation, Kalen found the lack of logic compelling. It suggested a motivation that transcended simple self-preservation, a motivation he did not yet understand. He cross-referenced the Omega's educational records with its med lab work assignments. Officially, Unit 734's duties were menial: sterilization, waste disposal, inventory. But there were gaps: unscheduled maintenance logs for the bio-printers, anomalies in the dispensary's chemical stores, minuscule amounts written off as spillage or evaporation. But over time, they formed a pattern of meticulous, patient theft. It had been gathering its materials for years, right under their noses. He felt a grudging respect for the sheer discipline it must have taken. The long, silent years of planning. The risk. He was missing a key variable. The synthetic compounds alone could not account for the stability of the forgery. There had to be a biological component, something unique to the Omega itself. He accessed its genetic profile again, scanning the long strings of code. Everything was optimal, a perfect specimen. He ran a deeper diagnostic, one that searched for recessive traits, for dormant mutations. The system flagged a sequence deep within the junk DNA, a marker so rare it was considered a statistical improbability, a primitive gene, one associated with early pre-Bastian Omegas, the gene for pheromonal mimicry. It was a relic, an evolutionary echo. In primitive societies, some Omegas had been able to subtly alter their scent to attract more desirable mates or to soothe aggressive alphas. The ability had been deemed a source of instability, a tool of deception, and had been systematically bred out of the population. It was not supposed to exist anymore, but it existed in Unit 734. Suddenly, the equation began to resolve. The Omega had not just used synthetic chemicals, it had used its own unique biology as a catalyst. It had somehow activated this dormant gene, using it to bind the synthetic pheromones to its own cells, to teach the forgery how to behave, how to live. It wasn't just a chemical fabrication, it was a true biohack, a symbiotic creation of science, unsuppressed instinct. Kalen stared at the genetic code, a profound sense of discovery washing over him. This was not a simple case of an asset gone rogue. This was the emergence of something new, something the Bastion's neat categories could not contain. He was not just an enforcer dealing with a rebel. He was a biologist who had just discovered a new species. He shut down the display, the office plunging into semi-darkness, lit only by the city lights beyond the window. The interrogation methods he had been using were wrong. He had been trying to break the Omega, to force it to confess its secrets. But its secrets were not in its mind. They were in its blood. He could not extract the information with psychological pressure. He needed to observe, to study, to understand the conditions that had allowed this dormant trait to manifest. He stood and walked to a small, climate-controlled compartment built into the wall of his office. He entered a code, and the door hissed open, revealing a single, perfect, hydroponic plant, a nightshade orchid. Its petals were a deep, velvety purple, and it only bloomed in total darkness. It was a relic from the old world, a piece of controlled, beautiful chaos he allowed himself. Its scent was subtle, complex, and utterly real. He carefully broke off a single dew-kissed leaf. He took the leaf and walked back toward the holding cells. The enforcers outside the cells snapped to attention. "Open it," he commanded. The door slid open. Elara, startled from its light sleep, scrambled into a defensive crouch. Kalen entered the cell, and the door closed behind him. The soft lights came up. He stopped several feet away, holding up the leaf. "A peace offering," Kalen said, his voice softer than before. Or, more accurately, a variable. Elara stared at the leaf, then at him. Its eyes narrowed with suspicion. "A new test?" "Everything is a test," Kalen replied, his voice a low murmur. He placed the leaf on the floor, halfway between them. "I am re-evaluating my approach." He sat in his designated chair, his posture relaxed, observational. "Your genetic profile is remarkable, Unit 734, a throwback, a living fossil." Elara's eyes flickered with surprise. He hadn't expected the warden to uncover that. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Denial is pointless. I have the data," Kalen said calmly. "The dormant gene for pheromonal mimicry. You activated it. That is the missing piece of the puzzle. I am no longer asking what you did. I am asking how you awoke a part of yourself that has been asleep for centuries." The question hung in the air. This was a different interrogation. It was not about accomplices or chemical formulas. It was about Elara's fundamental nature. He looked from Kalen's patient, analytical face to the dark green leaf on the white floor. The leaf was an object of profound alienness in this sterile environment. It was real. It would have a scent. He could almost imagine it, green, earthy, alive. It was a memory of the forest, a memory of freedom. Was it a trick, a kindness designed to disarm him? Almost certainly. But it was also an acknowledgement. Kalen was no longer treating him as a simple malfunction to be corrected. He was treating him as a complex anomaly to be understood. The power dynamic had shifted, however slightly. Slowly, cautiously, Elara crawled forward. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the leaf. It was cool and smooth. He brought it to his nose and inhaled. The scent was faint, but it was there. A green, living perfume that cut through the sterile air of the cell. It was the first real thing he had smelled in over a day. A wave of dizziness washed over him, a longing for the forest so sharp it was a physical pain. He looked at Kalen, his guard momentarily down, his eyes wide and vulnerable. In that moment, he was not Unit 734, the defiant rebel. He was just Elara, the boy who had tasted freedom and had it snatched away. "You have to be desperate," Elara whispered, the words coming out ragged. "You have to want to be something else so badly that your own body has no choice but to listen." Kalen did not move, but his grey eyes sharpened, recording every nuance of Elara's expression, every waver in his voice. The scientist had his first piece of viable data. The activation was not a matter of chemical triggers or genetic manipulation. It was an act of will, an emotional event, and emotion was the one variable the Bastion could not control, could not quantify, and had always underestimated. The equation of Unit 734 had just become infinitely more complex and infinitely more fascinating. The sensory deprivation ended. Elara was moved from the white room to a different kind of cell. This one was larger, furnished with a sleeping pallet, a sanitation unit, and a small table. One wall was made of transparent plasteel, looking out not into a corridor, but into Warden Kalen's office. He was living in a display case, a specimen in a terrarium. The silent, constant observation was a new form of violation, more intimate and unsettling than the darkness had been. He could see Kalen at his desk, analyzing data on the holographic displays, his profile stark against the glowing city lights. Sometimes, Kalen would simply watch him, his expression unreadable, for what felt like hours. Food was provided, the same nutrient paste he had always eaten, but it was now supplemented with small, strange additions. A piece of fruit one day, a root vegetable the next. Objects from the outside world, from the world Kalen called chaos. Each one was a test. Kalen would monitor his biosigns, his pheromonal output, his every reaction as he experienced these new tastes and textures. Elara knew he was being studied, his emotional responses catalogued as data points. He ate them anyway, savoring each small burst of flavor, each memory of the world he had lost. They were meant to be tools of manipulation, but he chose to see them as small acts of rebellion. He would take the warden's data and turn it into a private sensory feast. He learned to live with the warden's gaze. He developed a sort of internal privacy, a mental wall that Kalen's watchful eyes could not penetrate. He spent long periods in meditation, a practice he had taught himself in the Omega Wing, a way to find a quiet space inside his own mind. He would sit on his pallet, eyes closed, and focus on his breathing, shutting out the sight of the man who was both his jailer and his sole companion. One evening, Kalen entered his cell. This was unusual. He typically conducted his observations from the other side of the glass. He carried no weapon, no instruments, just a small silver box. "Your emotional state has stabilized," Kalen stated, his voice a low rumble in the quiet cell. "Your biosigns show a marked decrease in stress hormones. You are adapting." "I am surviving," Elara corrected, not looking at him. He remained seated on his pallet, his back to the transparent wall. "It's what I do." Kalen placed the silver box on the table. "I have a new, or variable for you." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, were dozens of small glass vials, each filled with a clear liquid. "Pheromonal isolates," Kalen explained. "Pure synthesized scents. Each one corresponds to a specific emotional state: fear, joy, serenity, anger." Elara finally turned to look at him. "Another test." "A diagnostic," Kalen corrected. "I want to observe the effect of external pheromonal stimuli on your unique biology. I want to see if your mimicry is a conscious act or an involuntary response." He picked up one of the vials. "This is a beta submissive pheromone. High concentration." He unstoppered it. The scent filled the small cell instantly. It was a wave of pure, cloying deference. It was the smell of the lower-level corridors, the scent of the medics and technicians. It was designed to be calming, to elicit a sense of safety and compliance. For Elara, it was the scent of his own subjugation. He felt a visceral revulsion. The glands on his neck tingled, an instinctive reaction. He fought it, clamping down on the biological response with sheer force of will. He would not submit. He would not perform for his captor. Kalen was watching him intently, a bioscanner held discreetly in his other hand. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Your own pheromonal output is fluctuating wildly. You are actively suppressing your natural response and attempting to generate a counter-agent, an alpha-dominant scent: aggression." He looked from the scanner to Elara's face. "You are trying to fight it with your own chemistry." Elara's breath was coming in short, sharp bursts. The effort was immense. It was like trying to hold back a tide. "Get it away from me." Kalen did not move. He unstoppered another vial. The scent that emerged was sharp, acrid. Alpha rage. It was a suffocating, terrifying scent, designed to trigger immediate fear and submission in an Omega. It was the scent of punishment, of the enforcers dragging away an Omega who had broken a rule. Ilara's body reacted before his mind could. A low whimper escaped his throat, a sound of pure, primal fear. He curled in on himself, his hands flying up to cover his neck, an instinctive gesture to protect his scent glands, his vulnerability. He hated himself for it. He hated his body for its pre-programmed responses. He hated Kalen for using his own biology against him. Involuntary response, Kalen noted, his voice as clinical as ever. He stoppered the vial, and the oppressive scent began to dissipate. Your conscious will can overcome a passive agent, but not an aggressive one. Your instinct is still stronger than your intellect. Tears of frustration and shame pricked Ilara's eyes. He squeezed them shut. "What is the point of this?" he choked out. "To prove I'm nothing more than an animal?" Kalen was silent for a moment. He walked over and sat on the edge of the table. A breach of protocol, a change in their established dynamic. He was no longer just the observer. He was in the experiment with him. "The point," Kalen said, his voice losing some of its clinical edge, "is to understand the dichotomy. You possess a biological ability rooted in the most primal of instincts, yet you have used it to achieve a goal of pure intellectual defiance. You are a paradox, Unit 734, a creature of instinct who despises instinct. I want to understand why." Ilara looked up, his tear-streaked face hardened with a sudden raw anger. "Because your order has taught me to. You take our instincts, the things that make us who we are, and you tell us they are flaws. You tell us our heats are a sickness to be suppressed with drugs. You tell us our desire for a true mate is a primitive urge to be replaced with a sanitized, genetically approved assignment. You breed out everything that is wild and real, and then you wonder why we break. You built this paradox, Warden. I am just its living proof." The outburst left him breathless, trembling. He had never spoken like that to an alpha, to anyone. It was a dam breaking, years of repressed anger and grief pouring out into the sterile air of the cell. Kalen did not react with anger or punishment. He simply watched, his grey eyes unblinking, absorbing the tirade. He was processing it, not as an emotional outburst, but as a data-rich thesis statement. Ilara had just handed him the core of his motivation. "We did it to ensure survival," Kalen said quietly. "To protect you. The old world was a brutal place for Omegas. They were property, victims of alpha aggression. The Bastion gave you safety, stability. You gave us a prettier cage," Ilara shot back. "You called it a sanctuary, but you never gave us a key." A long silence fell between them. The air still carried the faint, ghostly traces of the synthesized emotions, a cocktail of fear and submission. But now, mingling with them, was the raw, honest scent of Ilara's own defiant grief. It was a scent Kalen had never encountered before. It was not in any of his vials. It was complex, heartbreaking, and utterly authentic. For the first time, Kalen felt a flicker of something that his own conditioning could not immediately classify. It was not pity. It was not sympathy. It was a disquieting sense of recognition, as if he were looking at a reflection of a part of himself he had never known existed, the part that questioned the perfection of the system, the part that felt the cold weight of the cage even from the outside. He stood up, gathering the vials. "The diagnostic is complete," he said, his voice once again formal, distant. He walked to the door without looking back, but as it slid open, he paused. "The key you made," he said, his back still to Ilara. "It was remarkable." Then he was gone. Ilara was left alone in the cell, the echo of the warden's final words hanging in the air. It was not a compliment. It was not an admission of defeat. It was a simple statement of fact from one brilliant mind to another. And in the cold, sterile world of the Bastion, it was the closest thing to understanding he had ever known. He curled up on his pallet, the anger and fear slowly receding, replaced by a profound, aching exhaustion. The crack in the warden's facade was growing, and Ilara wondered, with a terrifying flicker of hope, what would happen if it finally broke. The revelation of Ilara's genetic anomaly sent ripples through Kalen's perfectly ordered existence. His work, which had once been a matter of enforcing established protocols, now became a singular, obsessive focus. He requisitioned restricted historical texts, delving into the pre-Bastion era, a time of chaos his education had taught him to view with clinical disdain. He read accounts of Omegas who could sway political outcomes with a shift in their scent, of bonds forged in passion and war rather than in genetic labs. It was a world of violent, unpredictable emotion, a world of instinct, the world Ilara claimed the Bastion had stolen. He began to see the Omega not as Unit 734, a defective asset, but as Ilara. The name, once an irrelevant phoneme, now held a specific weight in his mind. It was the designation for the anomaly, the puzzle he was consumed with solving. He spent hours watching the feed from the cell, but his observations were different now. He was no longer just collecting data on a subject. He was studying a person. He watched Ilara meditate, his face a mask of serene concentration, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil he had unleashed. He watched him trace patterns on the floor with his finger, lost in a world of his own making. He saw not a prisoner, but a mind desperately trying to find space to breathe in a vacuum. One night, Kalen found himself unable to focus on his work. The numbers on his screen blurred, the reports seemed meaningless. His attention was continually drawn to the transparent wall, to the still figure of Ilara sleeping on the pallet. The Omega looked younger in sleep, the hard lines of defiance softened. The forged bond mark on his neck was visible, a pale scar against his skin, a lie, a brand of defiance. Kalen had spent his life in service to biological truth, to the sacred absolutes of alpha, beta, and omega dynamics. Ilara's very existence was an affront to that truth. And yet, Kalen rose from his desk and walked to the plasteel wall. He placed a hand on the cool, smooth surface, his fingers spreading out as if he could feel the presence of the person on the other side. The system he had dedicated his life to was built on the premise of biological destiny. Alphas lead, betas serve, omegas create, simple, pure, efficient. But Ilara's ability was a wild card, a variable from the past that threw the entire equation into question. If an omega could forge a bond, could manipulate the very scent of their being, what did that say about the immutability of their roles? If biology could be directed by will, then destiny was not a pre-written code. It was a choice. This thought was a dangerous heresy. It chipped away at the foundations of his world. He finally understood the true nature of his obsession. It was not just scientific curiosity. It was a deep, unsettling need to either disprove Ilara's heresy or to understand it so completely that he could incorporate it into his own worldview without it shattering everything he believed. He needed to find the flaw in Ilara's logic, the emotional instability that drove his rebellion, to prove that the Bastion's order was still the superior path. He needed to prove that Ilara's freedom was just a self-destructive fantasy. He made a decision. He overrode the standard protocols and entered the cell. Elara woke instantly, sitting up, his body tensing. The scent of alarm, sharp and metallic, filled the air. "Be still," Kalen said, his voice low. "I am not here to conduct a test." He walked to the pallet and, after a moment's hesitation, sat on the floor a few feet away. It was a gesture of equality that felt alien and significant. He was placing himself on the Omega's level, abandoning the high ground of his authority. "Tell me about the forest," Kalen said. The question caught Elara completely off guard. He stared, his suspicion warring with confusion. "Why?" "It is a data point I lack," Kalen replied, his gaze steady. "You risked everything for it. I wish to understand its value." Elara was silent for a long time, studying the warden's face. There was no artifice there, no hint of a trick, only a genuine, analytical desire for information. He thought back to that one brief week of freedom, the smell of the rain, the feel of mud, the rough bark of the trees. "It was loud," Elara began, his voice soft, hesitant. "Not with noise but with life. Everything was moving, growing, dying. Nothing was sterile. Nothing was permanent. The light changed with the time of day. In the bastion, the light is always the same." He looked at his hands. "I touched a flower. Its petals were so thin, they were almost transparent. And it smelled sweet. Not like a synthesized fragrance. It was a real, living sweetness. It was going to die. And that's what made it beautiful." Kalen listened without interruption, his mind building a sensory map from Elara's words. He tried to imagine this world of imperfection, of change, of decay. It was inefficient, illogical, and yet, the way Elara spoke of it, it held a powerful allure. "You speak of chaos as if it is a thing of beauty," Kalen observed. "It's a thing of truth," Elara countered. "The bastion is a beautiful lie. You pretend there is no death, no imperfection, no pain. But there is. You just hide it behind white walls and call it recalibration." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and true. Kalen had authorized countless recalibrations. He had always seen it as a necessary clinical procedure, a way of correcting defects to maintain the health of the whole. He had never considered it from the perspective of the one being corrected. He had never thought of it as pain. "I have made a discovery," Kalen said, changing the subject, but the shift was not lost on Elara. It was a retreat. "I have identified the gene that allows your ability, a recessive trait, dormant for generations." He paused, watching Elara carefully. "I believe your escape, the desperation you spoke of, was the catalyst that activated it, an extreme emotional state triggering a latent biological function." Elara said nothing, but his eyes confirmed it. "I am the warden of the bastion," Kalen continued, his voice taking on a new intensity. "My duty is to identify and neutralize threats to its stability. You, Elara, are the greatest threat this institution has faced in a century. Your ability, if it could be replicated, would shatter the social order. It would allow any Omega to choose any Alpha, to forge bonds for political power, for personal gain. It would return us to the chaos we evolved to escape." A cold dread washed over Elara. This was it. The verdict. "So you're going to have me dissected," he said, his voice flat, "to learn how to prevent this from ever happening again." "That would be the logical, prudent course of action," Kalen agreed. He leaned forward, his grey eyes locking onto Elara's. "But I am a scientist before I am a warden, and destroying a unique specimen is anathema to a scientist. Your existence presents a different opportunity, not just to patch a flaw in the system, but to improve it. Improve it? How? A controlled expression of your ability, Kalen mused, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Imagine it. Bonds that could be assigned not by chance or primal instinct, but by logic, forged for optimal genetic outcomes, for political stability. Your ability could be the key to perfecting the Bastion, to removing the last vestiges of chance and emotion from the equation of our future. Ilara felt sick. Kalen had seen his miracle of defiance and was trying to turn it into another tool of control, a more efficient gear in the same machine he had tried to break. "No," he whispered. "You can't. It's mine." "It is an anomaly that exists within my jurisdiction," Kalen stated coldly. "It is mine to study. It is mine to control." He reached out, his hand moving slowly, deliberately. He gently touched the forged bond mark on Ilara's neck. His fingers were cool, his touch clinical, yet it sent a jolt through Ilara's entire body. It was the first time Kalen had touched him, the first time anyone had touched him with anything other than clinical efficiency in years. "This," Kalen said, his thumb tracing the faint scar, "is a claim, a declaration of ownership. You forged it in my name. A lie, yes, but a powerful one. One that has tied your fate irrevocably to mine." His gaze was hypnotic, a vortex of cold intellect and burgeoning obsession. "You are not an asset to be recalibrated. You are not a prisoner to be punished. You are my discovery, and I will not allow anyone else to have you." The words were a threat, a promise, a cage snapping shut, its bars forged not of steel, but of the Warden's possessive, terrifying fascination. Kalen's scent, that cold, clean scent of ozone and authority, seemed to intensify, wrapping around Ilara. But underneath it, for the first time, Ilara could detect a new note, faint but undeniable, the scent of an alpha's possessiveness. It was not the calm, controlled scent of the Warden. It was the primal, instinctive scent of Kalen, the man. And that, Ilara realized with a surge of terror and a strange, unwelcome flicker of something else, was infinitely more dangerous. The lie he had created was beginning to take on a terrifying life of its own. Kalen's declaration hung in the air between them, a tangible thing. "You are my discovery." The words echoed the Bastion's core ethos, ownership, classification, control, but the undercurrent was something far more personal, more primal. Ilara felt a profound shift in the nature of his confinement. He was no longer a problem for the system. He was a possession of the man who ran it. The sterile, observational distance Kalen had maintained was gone, replaced by a suffocating proximity. His cell was no longer a holding pen. It was the inner sanctum of the Warden's obsession. The days that followed were a strange blend of intimacy and interrogation. Kalen moved a terminal and a chair into the cell itself, conducting his work from within Ilara's transparent prison. The pretense of separation was abandoned. They shared the same recycled air, the same oppressive silence. Ilara could smell the faint, clean scent of Kalen's uniform, the sterile tang of the data slates he worked on. He learned the subtle shifts in the alpha's posture that signaled frustration or a breakthrough. He learned the rhythm of his breathing as he slept in his own quarters, visible through the plasteel wall. It was a forced, non-consensual intimacy that frayed his nerves raw. Kalen, for his part, seemed to view this new arrangement as a more efficient method of data collection. He would ask questions at random intervals, probing Ilara's past, his thought processes, the mechanics of his emotional responses. Describe the precise sensation of activating your mimicry. What is the emotional correlate of the scent of rain? When you forged my scent, did you choose it for its authority, or was there another factor? Ilara resisted, giving clipped, evasive answers. But Kalen was relentless. He was like a force of nature, slowly eroding Ilara's defenses with his patient, unyielding curiosity. The warden was trying to map his soul as if it were an unclassified territory. One afternoon, Kalen was analyzing a complex protein sequence on his terminal, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ilara sat on his pallet, watching him, a familiar sense of helpless anger simmering within him. He was a butterfly pinned to a board, his every flutter and twitch recorded. "You'll never find it," Ilara said, his voice quiet but sharp. Kalen looked up, his grey eyes coolly inquisitive. "Find what?" "The off switch," Ilara clarified. "The genetic marker that will let you control it. You think my ability is a function, a piece of code you can rewrite. It's not. It's a part of me. It's tied to my will. You can't have one without the other." "All biological systems can be controlled," Kalen countered, his tone absolute. "It is simply a matter of finding the correct input." "And you think you can find it by keeping me in a box and feeding me scraps from your world?" Ilara's voice rose, laced with a bitterness he could no longer contain. "You bring me a leaf, a piece of fruit. Do you think a taste of chaos is enough to understand it? You are a child looking at a star through a telescope, thinking you understand the fire that fuels it. You see the light, but you can't feel the heat." Kalen set his data slate aside. He stood and walked toward Ilara, his shadow falling over him. "Then make me understand," he said, his voice a low challenge. "Show me the heat." The air crackled with tension. Ilara's heart hammered against his ribs. It was a test, another one. Kalen was goading him, trying to provoke a reaction he could measure and analyze. But it was also an opportunity, a chance to show him something he couldn't see on a scanner. Ilara closed his eyes, drawing on the memory of the forest. He remembered the feeling of the sun on his skin after the rain, the overwhelming scent of life, the sheer chaotic joy of being free. He let that feeling fill him, a warm, bright wave pushing against the cold despair of his captivity. He focused that feeling, that memory, and pushed it outward. His scent began to change. The faint, anxious smell of a captive Omega bled away, replaced by something new, something wild. It was the scent of damp earth, of crushed pine needles, of the clean air after a storm. It was the scent of his one perfect week of freedom, concentrated and made real through his own biology. Kalen took an involuntary step back. His eyes widened slightly, the first genuine expression of shock Ilara had ever seen on his face. The warden's own scent flared, a sharp spike of ozone and something else, confusion. He was smelling a memory. He was smelling an emotion. The sterile air of the cell was thick with the impossible perfume of a wild, untamed world. "How?" Kalen whispered, his clinical composure completely shattered. He was a man who had lived his entire life in a sealed, scent-neutral environment. This was a sensory assault, a violation of the very principles of his existence. "This is what you can't control," Ilara said, his voice trembling with the effort. "This is what you can't synthesize. It's not just chemistry, Warden. It's feeling. It's life. And it's something you will never, ever understand. As long as you hide in this this tomb. The effort drained him. The scent faded, leaving the sterile neutrality of the cell in its wake, which now seemed more oppressive than ever. Elara swayed, a wave of dizziness washing over him. Kalen moved with surprising speed, catching him before he could fall, his hands gripping Elara's arms. The contact was electric, skin on skin. Through the thin fabric of Elara's tunic, he could feel the strength in the warden's hands. Kalen's face was close, his expression a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. Scientific awe, bafflement, and something else, something darker and more intense, stirring in the depths of his grey eyes. His gaze dropped to the forged bond mark on Elara's neck, the lie that had started all of this. "You are right," Kalen said, his voice rough, almost unrecognizable. "I cannot understand it from a distance." His grip on Elara's arms tightened. "Perhaps the variable is not what I am observing. Perhaps the variable is me." He was no longer the scientist observing the specimen. He was part of the experiment. The scent of the forest had done more than shock him. It had woken something in him. Some dormant, primitive part of his own alpha biology, a part that was not governed by logic or protocol, the part that recognized the scent of a unique, powerful omega and felt a primal, possessive urge to claim it, not for the Bastion, not for science, for himself. He lowered his head, his face just inches from Elara's neck. Elara froze, a surge of pure terror rendering him immobile. Kalen inhaled deeply, his scent now thick with a possessiveness that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He was scenting the mark, the forgery. He was comparing the ghost of his own scent, the one Elara had created, with the raw, honest scent of Elara's own skin beneath it. "An imperfect copy," Kalen murmured against his skin, his breath warm. "The original is infinitely more compelling." He did not bite. He did not make a claim. He simply held Elara there for a long, breathless moment, a predator tasting the air, contemplating the nature of its prey. Then he released him and stepped back, his face once again a mask of control, but his eyes held a new, dangerous light. The wall between observer and observed had been irrevocably breached. The sterile laboratory had become a cage for two, and the experiment was now running on its own, careening toward a conclusion that neither of them could predict or control. The warden had felt the heat, and Elara had the terrifying premonition that he would not be satisfied until he was consumed by the fire. The aftermath of Elara's demonstration was a thick, vibrating silence. Kalen retreated, both physically and emotionally. He moved his workstation back into his office, and the transparent wall once again became a barrier, a symbol of the distance he was trying to re-establish. But the barrier was porous. The memory of the forest scent, of the physical contact, lingered in the space between them. Kalen would look up from his work, his gaze drawn to Elara, and their eyes would meet through the plasteel. In those moments, the carefully constructed roles of warden and prisoner, scientist and specimen would dissolve, leaving only two individuals locked in a complex, unwilling orbit. Kalen's behavior grew more erratic. He pushed himself to the brink of exhaustion, working for days without sleep, driven by a new urgency. He was not just trying to understand Elara's ability anymore. He was fighting a war within himself. The primal, possessive instinct that Elara had awakened was in direct conflict with a lifetime of conditioning, with the core tenets of his identity. He was an agent of order, a believer in logic and control. The raw, chaotic feelings Elara provoked in him were a malfunction in his own system, a defect he was trying to analyze and purge. His scent, once a constant, controlled signal of authority, would now fluctuate subtly. Ilara, with his heightened senses, could detect the faint underlying notes of frustration, of conflict, of a tightly leashed possessiveness. Kalen was unraveling. The system he governed began to feel the effects of his distraction. Reports went unread. Minor infractions in the lower sectors were overlooked. A shipment of suppressants for the Omega wing was delayed due to a clerical error he failed to catch. Small cracks began to appear in the perfect facade of the bastion, mirroring the cracks appearing in its warden. One night, Ilara was awakened by a loud crash from the office. He sat up, his heart pounding. Kalen was standing in the middle of the room, his back to Ilara. He had swept a pile of data slates from his desk. Their shattered casings littered the polished floor. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The scent rolling off him was a turbulent storm of rage and confusion. It was the first time Ilara had ever seen him lose control. "It is not logical," Kalen said, his voice a low, grating snarl, directed at the city lights beyond the window, at himself, at the universe. Pheromonal compatibility is a measurable metric. Emotional response is a biochemical reaction. This is a statistical impossibility. He was talking about his own reaction to Ilara. He was trying to reduce the storm inside him to an equation, and failing. He turned slowly, and his eyes, wild and intense, found Ilara through the glass. "You did this," he accused, his voice raw. "Your chaos. It's infectious." He strode to the wall and slapped his palm against the control panel. The transparent plasteel turned opaque, a milky white wall descending between them, severing the visual connection for the first time since Ilara's arrival. The sudden blindness was a shock. Ilara was alone again, but the isolation was different. It was not the cold, sterile isolation of the sensory deprivation cell. This was a charged, deliberate separation, a quarantine. Kalen was trying to contain him, yes, but he was also trying to protect himself from him. The opaque wall did little to sever the connection. Ilara could still feel the warden's presence on the other side, a restless, caged energy. He could still smell the turmoil in his pheromones bleeding through the air recyclers. Kalen was pacing, a caged alpha. The irony was not lost on Ilara. In his attempt to control the anomaly, Kalen had become one. The system of order had bred its own chaos, right at its very center. For 2 days, the wall remained opaque. Ilara was left in a state of limbo, his food delivered by a silent service drone. The silence from the other side was more unnerving than the constant observation had been. He found himself straining to hear any sound, any sign of the man whose presence had become the central reality of his life. He hated this dependency, this strange, twisted symbiosis that had grown between them. Kalen was his jailer, his tormentor, but he was also the only person who had ever truly seen him, not as an asset, but as a force to be reckoned with. On the 3rd day, the wall slid away. Kalen was standing there, his uniform immaculate, his hair perfectly combed. The mask of control was back in place, but his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and the lines around his mouth were tighter. He looked older, more human. He entered the cell. His scent was carefully controlled, neutral once more, but it was a thin veneer over the turbulence beneath. "There has been an incident," Kalen stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Another Omega, from the residential spire you were assigned to. It attempted to breach the outer perimeter. It was terminated. Elara felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Someone had tried to follow his example. Someone had heard the rumor of the bonded Omega who had simply walked away, and they had tried to do the same. But they didn't have his skills. They didn't have his unique biology. They had only his hope, and it had gotten them killed. The Council is demanding a full security review, Kalen continued, his gaze fixed on a point over Elara's shoulder. They are questioning my methods, my stability. They have reviewed the logs of my interactions with you. They have flagged them as irregular. They believe I have been compromised by the anomaly. Have you? Elara asked softly. Kalen's eyes finally met his. I have been altered, he admitted, the words costing him. My objectivity is compromised. The Council has issued a directive. You are to be transferred to the recalibration center at 0800 tomorrow for full psychological deconstruction and biological analysis. He paused. They mean to take you apart, Elara, mind and body, to find out how you work and then to erase you. This was it. The end of the line. Dissection. The ultimate violation. The cold, final victory of the system. Elara felt a strange sense of calm descend upon him. He had fought. He had been free, if only for a week. He had cracked the uncrackable warden. It was more than any other Omega had ever done. And you will allow it, Elara stated. It was not a question. You will follow your orders, because you are a part of the machine. It is the logical course of action, Kalen said, the words sounding hollow, rehearsed. It will restore stability. He turned to leave, but he stopped, his hand on the door control. His back was to Elara. He stood there for a full minute, a statue of indecision, the perfect, logical warden warring with the altered, compromised man he had become. There is another option, he said, his voice so low Elara barely heard it. A statistically improbable, highly irrational alternative. He turned back, and his eyes burned with a desperate, feverish intensity that stole the air from Elara's lungs. The bond mark you created is a forgery, a lie, but it is a lie the system has already accepted as truth. The only thing it lacks is the biological reality to sustain it. He took a step closer, his scent finally breaking free of his control, thick with the possessive, primal aroma Elara had scented before. We could make it real, Kalen whispered. A true bond. My claim. It would be irrevocable. It would place you under my absolute protection, outside the Council's jurisdiction. They could not touch you. You would be mine, officially, absolutely. The anomaly would be contained, integrated. Stability would be restored. Elara stared at him, his mind reeling. The ultimate irony. The path to survival was to embrace the very thing he had faked to escape, to surrender his freedom to save his life, to put on the beautiful collar for real, so the machine would not tear him apart. It was not a choice. It was a checkmate. And what would you get, Warden? Elara asked, his voice trembling. Your pet project, safe in its cage? Your living paradox, all to yourself? I would get the solution to the equation, Kalen said, his voice raw with an emotion Elara couldn't name. It was hunger. It was desperation. It was the sound of a man who had stared into the chaos he feared and found he could not look away. I would get to understand the heat. I would get to contain the fire. He took the final step, standing directly in front of Elara, close enough that Elara could feel the heat radiating from his body. This is your choice, Elara, recalibration and erasure, or me. The choice was a lie. There was no choice. There was only the machine and the man who held the keys. A cage of oblivion, or a cage for two. Ilara looked into Kalen's grey eyes, the eyes of the system, and saw the reflection of his own desperate, cornered self. He had started a fire to escape a prison of ice. And now, the warden was offering him the only shelter from the flames. The heart of the inferno itself. The silence in the cell was absolute, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Kalen's ultimatum hung between them, a bridge and a chasm all at once, recalibration and erasure, or me. It was the most terrible and compelling offer Ilara had ever received. He looked at Kalen, truly looked at him, past the severe lines of his uniform, past the cold authority of his title. He saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the faint tremor in his hand that he quickly concealed. He saw a man who had built his entire world on a foundation of absolute certainty, and Ilara had become the earthquake that had fractured it all. Kalen was not offering a deal out of logic or strategy anymore. This was an act of desperation. An alpha, compromised by an omega, was using the last tool of control he had left, the bond. Ilara thought of the omega who had died trying to follow his path. He had given that person a fatal dose of hope. He had shown them the cage had a door, but had failed to warn them of the guards. His rebellion had consequences beyond his own survival. He felt a cold weight of responsibility settle upon him. If he was erased, his story would become a cautionary tale, a ghost story whispered in the Omega wing to ensure compliance. His defiance, his unique gift, would be sterilized, catalogued, and buried. But if he lived, if he accepted this terrible bargain, he would remain. A flaw in the system, a ghost in the machine, living right at its heart. He would be a constant, undeniable reminder that the Bastion's order was not absolute. "You say it would be a true bond," Ilara said, his voice steady despite the frantic beating of his heart. "A bond is a surrender. An Omega submits to an Alpha. My will would become yours. Is that what you want? To finally solve your equation by erasing it?" Kalen's expression was stark. His control stretched to its breaking point. "I do not know what I want anymore," he confessed, the admission a seismic event. "I know only that I will not allow the Council to destroy you. I will not allow them to take my discovery." The word still tasted of possession, but it was laced with something else now. A fierce, protective instinct. "A bond is not erasure," he continued, his voice dropping lower, more intense. "Not this one. It would be a convergence. Your chaos and my order, your instinct and my logic. I do not wish to destroy your will, Ilara. I wish to bind it to mine." It was a beautiful, poetic lie, a gilded cage offered by a master wordsmith, but perhaps within the lie there was a sliver of truth. Kalen was as trapped in this as he was. They were two anomalies, bound together by a forged mark and a shared obsession. Maybe this wasn't an ending. Maybe it was a different kind of beginning. "On my terms," Ilara said, the words tasting of ash and power. Kalen's eyes widened. He had expected a simple yes or no. He had not expected a negotiation. "What terms?" "The research," Ilara stated, his resolve hardening. "You want to understand my ability. Then I will be your partner, not your specimen. I will have access to your lab, to your data. We will study it together." He took a breath, pushing further. "And the suppressants. For all of them. In the Omega wing. You will reduce the dosage. You will allow them a measure of their own biology back. It was an impossible demand. It went against decades of protocol. It would be a fundamental change to the system. He was asking the warden to betray the very order he was sworn to uphold. He expected a flat refusal. Instead, Kalen stared at him, a slow, dawning realization on his face. He was seeing the full scope of Elara's ambition. He had not just been trying to save himself, he had been trying to start a revolution, a slow, quiet, biological revolution. You would use our bond as a political tool, Kalen breathed, a note of disbelief and grudging admiration in his voice. You taught me how, Elara countered. You said it yourself. A bond can be used for stability, for power. I'm just choosing a different kind of stability. The stability that comes from not breaking people. Kalen was silent for a long, agonizing moment. Elara could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes, the war between his ingrained duty and his new, chaotic reality. To agree was to commit treason against his own philosophy. To refuse was to hand Elara over to the butchers and lose the only thing that had ever made him question the perfection of his world. The terms are acceptable, Kalen said finally, each word a concession, a piece of his old self being sacrificed. In principle, the implementation will have to be gradual, subtle, but they are acceptable. And so the bargain was struck, not in a council room or with a signed treaty, but in a sterile cell between a jailer and his prisoner. Elara felt a wave of dizziness, the enormity of what he had just done crashing down on him. He had saved his life, but at what cost? He had traded one form of freedom for another kind of bondage. He nodded, a single, sharp gesture of assent. Then do it. Kalen moved closer, his presence filling the small space. The air grew thick, charged with the sense of their mingled apprehension and resolve. This was the moment the entire affair had been building towards. The lie was about to be burned away and reforged into a terrible, binding truth. Kalen reached out, his hand gently tilting Elara's head to the side, exposing the pale, scarred skin of his neck. The forged mark, his masterpiece of defiance, was now a symbol of his surrender. Look at me, Kalen commanded, his voice a low vibration that resonated deep in Elara's bones. Elara lifted his gaze, his sea-glass eyes locking with Kalen's winter sky grey. He saw no triumph in the alpha's expression. He saw only a terrifying, solemn gravity. He saw his own reflection in Kalen's wide pupils, a reflection of a boy who was about to be irrevocably changed. Kalen lowered his head. His breath was warm against Elara's skin. The first touch of his teeth was a sharp, electric shock. It was not a violent act. It was deliberate, precise, and absolute. A pain that was both an end and a beginning bloomed in his neck. It was nothing like the cold, clinical pain of the scalpel he had used on himself. This was a living pain, a searing heat that shot through every nerve, lighting him up from the inside out. He cried out, a raw, involuntary sound, his hands flying up to grip Kalen's shoulders. A flood of sensation overwhelmed him. He felt Kalen's genetic markers, a wave of alien code, flooding the wound. He felt the cells in his neck shifting, rewriting themselves, accepting the claim. And with it came a psychic echo, a torrent of the Alpha's own being pouring into him. He felt Kalen's rigid control, his obsession with order, his deep-seated loneliness, his shocking, terrifying fascination with Elara himself. He felt the Alpha's entire world, his entire soul, imprinting itself onto his own. His own scent glands erupted, releasing a wave of pure, unadulterated omega pheromones, a scent of submission and acceptance that he had suppressed his entire life. But mixed with it was his own unique signature, the scent of wild, defiant chaos. The two scents did not cancel each other out. They intertwined, creating a new, impossible fragrance, the scent of a paradox, the scent of them. When Kalen finally lifted his head, his lips were stained with a trace of Elara's blood. The forged mark was gone, replaced by a fresh, bleeding wound that was achingly, undeniably real. The warden's eyes were dark, his pupils blown wide, his control shattered by the primal force of the act. He was no longer just the warden. He was Elara's alpha. Elara's legs gave out, and Kalen caught him, pulling him flush against his chest. The bond settled between them, a living, breathing thing, a humming wire of connection that tied them together, mind, body, and soul. It was a chain. It was a shield. It was a cage. It was a key. Elara rested his head against Kalen's chest, listening to the steady, powerful beat of the alpha's heart. He was not free. He had not escaped. But he had not been erased. He had survived. And as he inhaled the new, shared scent that now defined his existence, he realized that the warden had been wrong. He hadn't just contained the fire. He had brought it into his own house, and they would both, from this moment forward, be consumed by its light and by its heat. The real experiment had just begun.